once again, we just don't know in the case of this product, on all those levels of detail, whether there is that kind of substantial equivalence, especially back to the initial unmodified parental lines for these food products. The other issue here, and is again another disconnect, the way that the regulations work is Health Canada doesn't say, like, we don't have to look at this at all. They say it's up to the applicant to tell us if there's something new here that we need to look at in detail. So they basically put the onus on Monsanto and Dow in this case to tell them if there's some unexpected thing that has shown up in their analysis that should suggest there should be a safety assessment. So the guidelines specifically say notification may be required for modifications observed in the progeny that result in a change of existing characteristics of the plant, and they kind of go into some details about that. So the burden is on the company to identify the changes. But it's interesting, in a newspaper article in the Globe and Mail, Trish Jordan from Monsanto was quoted a little while ago as saying, well, we haven't actually done the analysis, say at the level of detail the Royal Society would have required, because there was no trigger for an additional safety assessment. So Health Canada is saying, well, the onus is on the company to tell us that there's something new here. And the company is saying, well, Health Canada didn't tell us to provide any more data, and so we didn't look for any more data. We didn't gather any more data. And I think this is, well, as I put here, symptomatic of a larger issue of reliance on industry data to identify the problems in advance. But it's also a question of, like, who's really, who's responsible here. With regard to the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, I'll just briefly go through this idea of the reduction in BT refuges. So normally with these BT crops, the area that you should plant in non-BT crops has been 20% of the area that you would plant in BT crops. And the assumption there is that, and it's proved to be fairly accurate, is that by having a population of insect pests that are not exposed to the pesticidal protein, and they continually interbreed with the insect pests that are exposed to the pesticidal protein, some of whom will develop resistance to that protein, then you're kind of continually watering down the development of the insect resistance to the pesticidal protein. In the case of SmartStax, the decision that the Canadian Food Inspection Agency made was, and as well as the EPA, was that it was okay to reduce the size of that refuge from 20% of the field to 5%. And it has to do with the number of BT toxins that are expressed in the SmartStax crop, that it was felt a smaller refuge area is legitimate. Just a couple of little things that I pulled out of my notes along the way. The Officer of the Auditor General report in 2004 found that the CFIA could not actually verify compliance with the refuge requirements. In fairness to the CFIA, that was 2004, and they did a little bit of science after that to kind of gather these numbers, including, I believe they actually did some work with the Corn Pest Coalition, Canadian Corn Pest Coalition. And then these numbers started coming out that you're actually getting farmers, you're getting about 70% compliance with the refuge requirements, and those numbers seem to be going down a bit. The good news is, as far as I understand, that insect resistance is not developing very quickly to the BT crops, and I understand that that's part of the rationale the CFIA used for making this reduction in the refuge area. But the bigger concern I have is as a student of GMO regulation and how this all developed, it was a huge debate in the early 1990s among ecologists and molecular biologists and all kinds of scientists who were part of the debate about what would be a reasonable refuge requirement. And of course, at that time, they had limited data and they were doing a lot of predictive stuff, and they came up with this number of 20%. Maybe the number 20% is not the right number. Maybe it is 5%. Maybe it's somewhere in between. But the point is that the number was developed through very wide consultation and debate, and that it's obviously an important public decision. And the policy decision to go from 20% to 5% is a significant reduction that I think deserves, if not the same scale of debate, at least a wide input from outside experts. And in this case, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency says they have talked to some folks at Guelph University and brought in some outside expertise, but actually, I mean, they've told that to some of us in a telephone call, but we don't really know what they did and who they consulted because none of that information is available. So when it comes to this decision from the CFIA, I said one paragraph. I guess Lucy says it's 3 paragraphs that the CFIA has given us. But that's, you know, they really haven't given us a clear rationale and a clear sense of what kind of information have they looked towards to make this decision. One of the, this one paragraph, it's interesting to compare to look towards the United States, which used to be, well, never mind, but it's quite amazing to look towards the United States as the gold standard now with, with regards to what Michael was talking about. And even on the availability of information, if you go to the EPA website, there's a 17-page document outlining how they got to this decision about the refuge reduction. And we've got 1 to 3 paragraphs. But there's something that's quite important there, because if you look at the EPA document, again, the comparator when looking at, for making these decisions was not the initial non-modified parental lines, but the EPA decision is made based on the comparator of the 4 transgenic lines that were crossbred into SmartStax. My understanding of Canadian regulation is you can't use the genetically modified lines as the comparator. You'd actually have to go back to the non-modified lines. And whether that information even exists, whether Monsanto and Dow could provide it going back to the parental lines, I don't know. Presumably that's what they're going to have to provide in Europe as well. Maybe that's what they provided to the CFIA here in Canada, but we just don't know. The Office of the Auditor General in 2004 criticized the CFIA for lack of data and record of analysis to support conclusions, which may be the case again here. Again, we don't know. The Royal Society of Canada specifically said we need ecologically meaningful experimental protocols to ensure data quality, need for better baseline data, and I think the kind of studies that they were thinking about is the kind that Michael was talking about, where you really isolate the lines, grow them in very regulated environments, and then do the comparisons. And it's just hasn't been clear in the Canadian context whether that's the kind of data that's being looked towards by our regulators. So there's this question of input from outside experts that I related in relation to this BT refuge reduction. There's also a question of peer review, which was a central critique of the Canadian, again, the Royal Society of Canada in 2001, which argued that there should be a lot more room or regular use of outside experts. And specifically, the peer review process is quite clear. The notion of peer review in science should be independent, free of conflict of interest, carried out by technically qualified professionals. And they're also looking for, you know, reproducibility of the data. Ideally, that means that you actually have a level of detail on the data that you could do the experiments again and actually see if the data is valid in that sense. Interestingly, the CFIA on its website has this phrase. I don't know if it's still there. I know it was there in 2004. That explaining the value of peer review, it helps scientists and other readers distinguish between reputable scholarly work and work that is flawed or not of high quality. So this is on the CFIA's website, and I mean, I think I know there are good scientists there, and I know that they believe in this process, and I wish they would use it more often.